Hi everyone, I hope you're well. This next video is an interview with Nathaniel Gillis. He's a religious demonologist and author. Very interesting guy, very knowledgeable guy. It was an absolute pleasure to talk to him. He actually lived in a haunted house when he was a child and has spent 20 years researching what he encountered to try and unpick it and understand what had happened to him, what he had experienced. He's also the founder of the Preternatural Epiphenomenal Philosophy, and Nathaniel has sought to redefine the nature of the haunting phenomena and ghosts and high strangeness. And you've probably heard of him before. He's been on Coast to Coast, numerous other radio shows coming out of the States. He's often quoted for his concept of the demonic, in that the reason they are playing by different rules is because they are playing a different game. This was a really enjoyable interview. It was great to talk to Nathaniel. We were able to share ideas and compare notes, so to speak. I learned an awful lot about the Hebrew perspective on this phenomena, particularly around the Dybbuk box phenomena. And of course, we discussed the jinn, what the interest in human beings that these unpleasant spirits have, what's the rationale, what's the reason. Obviously, that's almost impossible to determine, but it's interesting to try and unpack it. So I'm going to stop talking and let you guys get on with listening. And without further ado, here is Nathaniel Gillis. So how did you get into this subject matter?
Well, it kind of got into me, if that makes any kind of sense. I grew up in a pastor's home, so I'm a pastor's kid.
Right.
And it started about when I was 8 years old, and we moved into a new house, and I started having what they call high strangeness.
Right.
Shadows, apparitions, noises, the stench of what Dr. Barry Taft would call decomposing or rotting organic matter, which is the sulfur that everybody's heard of,
Sure.
at least some people at least. But so after that, I began experiencing things that I had no frame of reference for. And growing older into my teens and into my 20s, I decided to say, you know what, maybe I wasn't crazy. Maybe there is something to what I experienced within the four walls of that home. Mm-hmm. And then that's when my research began. And it's just exactly like you said, it's a rabbit hole. A lot of times you'll get answers, and then once you get the answers, you'll just have to ask even more questions. But that's what I started. That's what got me into this research in this field, is trying to understand what happened to me so I can help other people understand what's happening to them. And it's a wild ride, brother. It's a wild ride.
Yeah, I believe you. Yeah, definitely. And those kind of experiences you had, and you're a kid and, and a teenager, it was just trying to understand them and put kind of context around them.
Yes, context, and it wasn't very advantageous of me to go to pastors, at least of my movement. I mean, for the most part, their conception of the afterlife was a 17th century, I guess, invention, I guess, what I'm saying. And, and they didn't know much. And obviously I didn't either as a kid, right? There's nothing I knew about it. But it wasn't very beneficial for me to go to clergy, because most of them were locked into the belief system of their current fellowship and organization, man. So that's what got me into it. And I started venturing out into studying the jinn, as yourself, going into the Dybbuk of Jewish legend and lore. And it really expanded my understanding of the spiritual plane in ways that I could have never even imagined. And I'm honestly blessed to even, be in this field.
It's strange how it happens. It's that first domino effect, the first falling domino, and before you know it, opens door after door after door, and your view of the world intrinsically changes.
Oh yeah.
It's really interesting how that can happen.
It forces you out, forces you into new dimensions. And I often liken it to looking into a dark room and looking into it enough to the point where your eyes adjust to the darkness. And I think that for centuries we have been staring into the darkness, hoping to see. And I'm excited about that moment when our eyes adjust and we really understand what it is that's going on in this field.
You gave me a bit of context around how you got introduced to this through your childhood, but mentioned that your Christian tradition didn't really give you the language or the spiritual technology to understand this or deal with it. In the broader Christian sense, what would you find what's going on?
All right. Well, just as the word jinn was slapped on to virtually a lot of different phenomena, so has the word demon been slapped onto anything remotely paranormal in Christianity. And the word demon was a functional migratory term that the Hebrew Israelites took from Mesopotamia. Well, obviously it's the Greek. That's Greek, right? But as far as the concept of a demon, they took from Mesopotamia and they slapped that term onto everything that they did not understand at that moment. And so what I had to deal with, even as a teenager, is going through history and sifting through the folklore that I inherited being a pastor's kid. And I had to sift through it to understand, okay, was this really a demon? Or was this simply something that terrified this person? And therefore does it make sense? They misinterpreted their fear. And so, when I grew up in Pentecostalism, and it's a very, I guess it's a very, very traditional and conservative movement. And they had a lot of manifestations. Mm-hmm. However, as many manifestations as they had, they were very much, I wouldn't say ignorant because that's not the word, but very much unlearned in the literature of the demonic and, some of the authors that have been around for centuries now. And so what I had to do was I bear the responsibility of taking this whole field that I was given in Pentecostalism and trimming all of this non-essentials to get to the heart of the matter. And the heart of the matter is this: not everything is a demon. Mm-hmm. And if it is, we have to ask ourselves what a demon is and what it is not. Mm-hmm. And so that's what led me through the Old Testament into the New. And right now, my focus is on understanding the Dybbuk phenomenon, because I think that is at the very core of what we're dealing with as far as haunted houses and, in fact, many possessions. And I'm really excited to get into that.
Oh, well, I think it's a great springboard to go into that subject. So by all means, let's hear some more about it.
Okay. Well, first of all, going into the Old Testament, when we go into like Psalms 91 and many other passages, we see the authors employ the word. It's the King James Version, 1611. It's demon, but in the Hebrew it was shadim. Shadim linguistically, it comes from the Akkadian word seidu, and seidu was not a horned or hooved demon. It was essentially a spirit that could be good or bad. And so when we read these passages and we say, okay, that's a demon, they're not saying it's horns and hooves. They're simply saying it's a spirit that's evil. And so we're going through like Psalms 91. He mentions in the Hebrew you don't get a lot of it, but if you take that and go through the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, you start to hear these terminologies that we're more familiar with, like Lilith, Pakad Lila, Resheth, and all of the other demons or idols of ancient antiquity. Right. So with that understanding, we have to focus our attention on the following question: are they really demons, or are they simply idols that are in another religious system? And that's germane to this conversation, because if they are idols, the Hebrew prophets, that they didn't just preach against them, they mocked them. They said they have eyes that can't see, mouths that cannot speak. Now David mentioned something in the book of Psalms that is absolutely, it rocked my world. It rocked my world because he gets done listing how these things don't exist and why you shouldn't believe in them. And then comes down to it and says, and after all that, they have no breath. I thought, man, that's a weird thing to say. You know what I mean? I was talking to somebody the other day and I said, if I asked you what the color purple smelled like, you wouldn't know because it doesn't exist, right? It's not even a part of our conversation. It's so far beyond this existence. Like, it's just stupid to ask the question. So then why would he mention the fact that they have no breath? And so then I began my focus into going into the demonology of the New Testament and how their demonology in Judaism, or First and Second Temple Judaism, changed from the old to the new. And that's when I really started to understand that it is highly possible, I'm just going to spit it out. It's highly possible that what many religions have considered to be demons are in fact disincarnate spirits that have their own belief systems still.
Right.
And that's what led me into understanding the Dybbuk phenomenon. And that right there, I mean, the Dybbuk, if the field really understood that concept of the Dybbuk, we would quit fiddling around with phone apps and trying to get EVPs.
Right. Okay.
Because it would, you know what I mean? It would change our entire understanding of this whole thing.
And just to help the listeners along, can you give us just an overview of about the Dybbuk phenomenon?
Absolutely. Well, the Dybbuk phenomenon is much like a zeitgeist to many. Most people, like I was introduced to this concept through horror movies and different kind of occult writings. And at first blush, a Dybbuk was essentially a body a person who had died, was put into a tomb, and then a year later was taken out, they placed the bones in a box, and then they buried that box. And then so the idea was that the haunting that would happen was simply the spirit of that individual haunting that box because his or her bones are in it. And so the pop culture terminologies and references to the Dybbuk box, it's not just a box that you go pick up at a grocery or at an antique shop. It's a box that had bones in it, that the spirit of the bones that it's hovering over it and it's attached to it. Now, I think is that idea and that limited understanding of this thing has cursed us to think one-dimensionally. And so when we hear about the Dybbuk, everything is just pop culture. But if we dig deeper into it, it will connect some veins into the thematic elements and the tapestry of this whole thing. It connects to some of the other demons, quote-unquote demons, that we have experienced for millennia. Let me just say this. A Dybbuk is not, nor has it ever been, a spirit that was attached to a box. That's what we were told it was. That's the pop culture, right? That's what sells movies. The Dybbuk phenomenon started in the 13th century. That's when they listed it as a Dybbuk. Prior to that, the Hebrews would use two words, ura, ara, and that is the Hebrew translation of unclean spirit. Now, the unclean spirit can be traced all the way to the New Testament. And it wasn't until after that we understood, they understood, well, maybe this is not an unclean spirit. Maybe it's a Dybbuk. And then their demonology changed from maybe it's not, right? Maybe it's not a demigod. Maybe it's not a deity. Maybe it's a disincarnate spirit. And from that point, from the 13th century on, because they had been casting demons out and everything prior to that, but that's when their demonology changed in a way that is virtually inconceivable. because now you have people like Isaac Luria in the 13th century. He wrote a book called the Zohar, and he was a Kabbalist, a Jewish Kabbalist, and an exorcist. And he comes out and he says, look, he says, these entities are not demons. They're simply evil spirits that are in fact disincarnate. And so the way he would deal with them is they would call them the Dybbuk, number one, and instead of, I guess, employing the rite of exorcism that Catholics do, they would actually talk to these entities. Why are you here? What's your name? Right? And they would have a dialogue with these entities, and then they would start to understand that this is not some demon from the gates of hell. This is actually a person who has human interests, human urges, a value system, and a belief system that humans have. And I think, again, like I said, if we can attach that and take it to this understanding of the demonic right now, we could actually, I think, learn a heck of a lot more about this thing than we could have ever imagined.
That's a really interesting perspective, and certainly I think you're absolutely correct. There has been a blanket approach to kind of anything that doesn't come under the explicit doctrine, whatever Abrahamic faith you're in, was just blanketly called a demon or something like. And that's one of the things that I found really interesting about the explorations and study I've undertaken with Islam. I'm from a Catholic background, and keeping on the motif of horror films, when you come, whenever exorcisms come up, it tends to kind of revert to the Catholic model all the time, and but that in modern Catholicism, that doesn't never really come up. It's not in the language or in the everyday of people. Whereas in Islam, it is, because it's a living tradition. It's a living tradition in Islam. And and Islam still has the technology and awareness to deal with these things appropriately. Something that certainly kind of, I can't speak for other Christian sects, but certainly within Catholicism, it has stepped away, and kind of in secular societies, we've got just completely lost. So for me, going back to kind of our earlier motifs of looking into that dark room, for me, we're feeling our way along the walls. When
we are.
We've completely lost our understanding, and it's these different strands of research that pull this all back together. So, I'm really interested in hearing more.
Yeah, and I value that. And let me tell everybody that's listening, it's very important to me, and it excites me to meet people like yourself who are not egocentric, and they're not in this to be known, and yet are very well read, very literate in this field. And I'm telling you, it's rare. I can't stress that enough. It is so rare to meet people who actually know what they're talking about, who don't even want to, like, they don't even want to be famous or anything about it. It's ridiculous how cheapened this field has become. And I very much value what you're contributing to this research. Now,
likewise, thank you.
If we take, let's back up here. If we take the idea of a demon and we strip it of the folklore that multiple religions and traditions have given it, there are essentially a handful of concepts that transcend the microcosm of Abrahamic religion. Number one, these entities, if they are an evil spirit, since the dawn of humanity, they have wanted blood sacrifices. Think about that. They wanted blood sacrifices. Why? We had a case with Deborah Moffat, who is back in the 70s. She called it Mr. Entity, where I guess it was her mother-in-law who was dying, and her maid or her, I don't know, there somebody was helping her. Maybe it was an in-house nurse. That's what it was. And she was into Santeria. And she did a Santeria rite, a ritual, basically invoking a spirit to help her employer, which is the mother-in-law, survive this bout she had with, I think it was cancer. Well, something that opened the door and something came through, and it began writing on a mirror. And it described its life, told them what he wanted, told them that he wanted a blood sacrifice. He wanted the mother-in-law to be sacrificed. And he even apported a spear into the room in the middle of the night.
Wow.
And gave them specific instructions on how to fulfill this rite to his wishes. Now, what scares me about this, terrifies me. What terrifies me is the fact that if they're playing by different rules than what religion has given us, then it means only one thing. It means that they're playing a different game.
Right.
And a part of feeling around in the walls is understanding that it is quite possible that these entities are using us as currency. In other words, it's taking things from us that's valuable to it and not very much valuable to us. So stripping it of the contextual understanding of religion and saying, okay, oh man, it's not just horns and hooves. No, that doesn't help us. You know what I mean? You can't, it has horns. Well, what does it believe in, right? What does it value? What matters to it? And so my research has led me into areas of psychology and trying to understand why these entities would want blood sacrifices.
Right.
Right? I mean, in every religion, I mean, most religions, if it's not an animal, it's a human. Why? And I think to kill something, to spill blood, and I mean, come on. It blows my mind that, because, you know, I grew up Christianity. I was taught that was all cool, right? Oh, that's no big deal. And I'm thinking right now, like, what? If you just saw a person come over here and pull out a dog and, you know, and do some god awful thing, and he said, oh, it's no big deal. I did this for my God. What would you think at that moment? Does it make sense?
Yeah.
So I had to strip myself of some of these understandings and organically grow into new dimensions of thought. But a demon having a desire for blood to the point where they're willing to import things into your home and give you explicit instructions. Number one, that means that there's an order to their thought process. There is an order. There is a value system present that is not our value system. They do not value what we value. And that's where I'm at right now. And my goal is to understand what it is they value. Because if these things for 3,000 years have been asking for blood sacrifices, what are they using it for? Does that make sense? I mean, and when you get into that, I mean, we can get into the Nephilim. I mean, it just opens the whole conversation up to something that it's crazier than Halloween would ever expect it to be.
Well, I have some thoughts on that. In terms of what's going on there.
I want to hear it.
And where my research and reading has led me to is that the energy that is given off during something as brutal as a human sacrifice, that actual energy of fear, and all the emotions associated with something as horrific as that is actually a form of food for a lot of these dark entities. That it's that predatorial nature is looking for that essence to feed upon it. And now it's
absolutely.
You know, it's quite a well bandied out theory that
Hmm.
you'll find that in a lot of places. I've heard the term loosh being attributed to naming
Hmm.
the essence that is the food for
Hmm.
demonic beings or dark entities. That's one element. The other element to it that struck me from what you're saying earlier is the use of the word currency, because I
Yeah.
think there is that aspect to it, and I do think it is. I do think it's down to kind of like our spiritual value, that where it be kind of soul or spirit, whatever word you want to attribute to it. I do think that does have
Hmm.
intrinsic value, and that it comes
Yes,
back,
it does.
back to that kind of cosmic battle of in a really really bad metaphor, um,
Hmm.
kind of the cosmic battle between good and evil, and our souls are the stakes. I think to some degree, I think that's what's happening. Um,
Absolutely.
I the interesting thing I find, because we always think about when we think about demonic um, intrusion into lives, it always gets attributed to kind of like full on 100% possession.
Right.
Is rare to a degree, but what isn't rare is the intrusion. I believe anyway that the intrusion
Hmm.
on self, the intrusion on will, and the idea for those kind of like those small battles that happen to everybody with on a very small scale, the intrusive thoughts, the negativity that is external but gets internalized.
Hmm.
I think that's the stuff that's happening on kind of on an industrial scale. Um, I made a short lecture called Was, which is around the Islamic idea of that, of the whispering of demons, the whispering of devils
Hmm.
intruding on people and kind of pushing them away from practicing their faith. And then through further,
Yeah.
and the exact same concept is in within Catholicism in terms of demonic oppression. Um,
Hmm.
they're almost a like for like. So you have this two Abrahamic faiths basically describing the same thing. Now, that
Hmm.
surprising, given that there's a direct lineage between both faiths. But when you start to unpack what they're saying about kind of the symptoms of was around kind of, I mean, they're very, very close to what you describe as very different types of mental illness. Um, but you think about kind of the level of people suffering in the world through different levels of anxiety, depression, and whatnot. You know, I'm not saying those things aren't real, and I'm not saying in any shape or form that those things can always be attributed to the intrusion of unwanted spirits. But imagine if a percentage of it was, and we're totally unprepared for that. We have no language for it. We have no spiritual
Yes.
dealing with it. Then we're
Talk on that, brother. Talk on that. Go down that road, man. We need it. We need to hear it. Go ahead, buddy. I'm excited.
yeah, we're going back to that motif of the dark room. We're walking into that room. There's stuff in there that is not good for us, and we are completely oblivious to it. And even if we are suffering
Hmm.
from the symptoms, we don't have any recourse to alleviate them. When you look at the
Yeah.
way of seeing things, when we've completely desacralized things, or we've dissociated from the spiritual being that's within all of us. We don't believe that world exists. Um,
Hmm.
is that kind of empirical worldview of like everything is a giant machine. We are complex,
Right.
meat clocks, and that's it. We're no more than the sum of our parts. And it just really kind of disassociates, or it's not the right word. It really kind of just removes the rest of the spiritual world from us. And
It does.
the Arabic word is al ghaib, if I'm pronouncing that properly.
Hmm.
Invariably not pronouncing it properly.
Hmm.
Which is the unseen world of which the jinn
Yes.
is. And the lack of understanding of that world, the actual kind of denial of it in any shape or form, to the point where it's a joke to most Western people, those concepts, it
Right.
was a terrible disservice to us. And I think the actual industrial level, of the global scale of anxiety and depression, some of it
Hmm.
attributed to this, or I think it needs to be explored. Um,
It does.
this is why people are turning to shamanic traditions to heal themselves, because we've removed our knowledge of spiritual healing of any description. We
Hmm.
really limit our technology. But within Islam, they have there is a form called a ruqya, which is a type
Hmm.
of healing that is sanctioned within Islam. You can see the roots of magic in it, in its
Hmm.
approach, but it is specifically technology for dealing with this kind of thing. You know, um, and we don't have that. You know, so we're
We don't, and we're blind, man. We're blind,
basically, yeah.
and that's what I'm getting into. And let me say this: when I was growing up in that haunted house, I was experiencing a profound amount of manifestation,
Right.
shadow figures, and going through all this. But even at such a young age,
Hmm.
even as terrified as it made me feel, because what would happen is the room would get dark. Obviously at nighttime it would get dark, but it would get darker than dark. And then there would be like a cloud of darkness. It was almost dark matter or antimatter in the corner, and it would make me feel like I was just the smallest, most meaningless thing in the world. But even at such a young age, I knew that there's a possibility that what I was feeling, this gets into what I call epiphenomenal preternatural philosophy, is I knew what I was feeling did not determine what and who this thing was. You
Right.
follow me?
Yeah.
So in Pentecostalism, one of the reasons that I struggled for a while, trying to find the wall or trying to find something in that dimly lit room, one of the reasons is because they put a demon on every spiritual experience that was not positive.
Right.
And so my question is, this gets back into the Dybbuk, and even Jinn, really. But my question is, what if we are not, like, because I was taught that, okay, if you're afraid, that's the spirit of fear. And for most people, that works, doesn't it? Oh, that makes sense. But it doesn't make sense. Oh, that's the spirit of suicide. What? So, like you said, we have to develop a whole new vocabulary for this
Mhm.
in order to understand it. And my question for everyone out there, including you, man, is this: what if we're not feeling the spirit of suicide? We're feeling a spirit who committed suicide.
Mhm.
And so that was the concept of the Dybbuk. Now, the very first pictorial tradition, the picture of a Dybbuk, was a man in Israel who's doubled over. He's got a cane. He's an older man. And he's got a skeleton clinging on to his back.
Wow.
Now, yeah, so that's in the first concept. The reason they painted it that way was because they believed that, number one, that was a disincarnate spirit on that living person. Number two, it was attached to him like a cloak.
Right.
And you're right in the terms of these exorcisms. Let me throw this out there. Let me throw this, and this gets into the Catholicism and how just murky these waters become. First of all, if these are demons, and all they do is lie, right? Everybody, oh man, that's all they do is lie. Don't ever believe them. Why would we ask them what their names are and then believe that?
Sure.
Right? It makes no sense. So these attachments have to be understood for what they are. I don't know if you had visited my Instagram page. Well, I think you probably have, like I've done yours, but there's a video that I put up. And one evening, I was on my downtime, and I was just, I was smoking a cigar and reading at my favorite, I guess, a pub, or I guess since you're from London, pub. And I was sitting there relaxing, and a buddy of mine knew what I do. And so he just took a person over to me and said, "Hey, Nate, He said this girl was talking to me about how she feels like her friend's house is haunted, and she wants to talk to you about it. So I'm sitting down and I'm talking to her, and her boyfriend's there. And she goes, yeah. She goes, my best friend lives about an hour away, and she lives with her grandfather, and the house is like 100 years old. And her grandfather was chased out of it by an entity, and it terrified him to the point that he had a heart attack and passed away in his own yard. And as she's talking to me, I see this darkness behind her. And I said, okay. I said, I got to stop this whole thing. She goes, why? I was like, I'm not trying to be rude. I said, but let me say this. I know you came here to see me, and I know you think you're here to talk to me about your friend's grandfather. I said, but that's not why you're here. And I said, you have an attachment of suicide on you. When I said that, she started crying. Her hands were shaking. She held her arm out, took my fingers, and made me feel the scar, the indentation in her wrists where she had tried to take her life a year ago.
Wow.
Yeah, this is the Dybbuk phenomenon, right? It's the attachment. Now, I said, now forget about her grandfather. Tell me about your grandfather. I said, because I feel depression, anxiety, and obviously suicide. I said, you've been dealing with emotions. This gets very interesting. I said, you've been dealing with emotions that are not your own. And I said, tell me why you tried to commit suicide. She said it was in 2014. 2014, my grandfather shot himself to death. And she said, we were very close. I said, I understand. And so while I'm talking to her, this gets crazy. I mean, not crazy as in lock me up, but this, I'm telling you, these Jewish exorcists, since the 13th century, they've been doing this for thousands of years.
Right.
They just had a case in Israel in 2005 where something like this happened. And so I'm talking to her, and as I'm talking to her, I realize that I'm talking to the grandfather.
Right.
Through her. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because she's feeling his emotions. And what emotions were they? Low self-esteem, guilt, depression, anxiety, fear, shame.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, listen, I said, look, there's a lot of people out there that because of their emotions that get unchecked, that are unchecked and unguided, that suddenly, not suddenly, but sooner than later, what happens is the words that their mouths cannot say, they begin to show up in their health, and the trauma that they could never articulate because of PTSD or something else begins to show up in other more physical ways. And I said, what I need you to do is to realize that these emotions are not your own. Mm. And I said, and once that happens, you'll be able to understand and decipher between, oh, well, I'm a nobody, or I'm tired of this life. I said, no. I said, what you need to do is we need to get that Dybbuk off of you so that you can, get close to your boyfriend. Well, while I was talking to her, she started shaking and started bawling. Mm-hmm. And I said, okay. I said, I feel it lifting. And I felt it. Boop. Just like that. It was gone.
Right.
And it was a powerful, spiritual, beautiful moment. And since then, her life has changed. But the reason I mention that story is for one reason and one reason only. Is it possible that many of these exorcisms are not merely just throwing holy water and, doing these rites and incantations and delivering the demoniac? What if it is we are traumatizing humans and they leave traumatized, they leave the person, and we call that deliverance. Deliverance for who? Mm-hmm. Right? Because that's why now Isaac Luria had a student, and like I said, Isaac Luria was perhaps the greatest Jewish exorcist that ever lived, ever, as far as, post first century, after the first century. But that's what they taught. They believed Isaac Luria taught Jaime Vital. And Jaime Vital was also an incredible exorcist. I mean, he was just a beast. And what he taught in his school was that in order to heal the person, you have to heal the spirit.
Right.
So now what impresses me, obviously many things impress me about you, but I was listening to your was presentation, and you mentioned someone who I'm a big fan of. You probably already know who I'm talking about. Jerry Marzinski.
Yeah.
Yes, his work is phenomenal.
Yeah.
But so that's more along the lines, and for those that don't know, his work is just, oh my God. You're talking about belief systems, brother.
Mm.
These entities have a whole different level, a whole different understanding, different value systems. So my question is, because I know I keep rambling, man. I'm not trying to, but this is such a deep subject.
Not at all.
Is it possible that we mortals have slapped the word demon throughout 3 different monotheistic religions, and truthfully, we're just dealing with disincarnate spirits who have what I call self-inherited guilt and shame from their life, and are still in their belief systems? I'll tell you why I ask that. Because if a demon is a demon, a demon is a demon, it would only fear one constitution, right? It would fear one constitution. Let me put it like this. You're from London, you're from Britain, Great Britain. I'm from Ohio.
Yeah.
I don't follow your rules.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if I'm supposed to be under your authority, which is what all these monotheistic religions teach that, right?
Yeah.
You're either under Yahweh, Jesus, or Allah. Mm-hmm. Unless they're all one and the same, mm-hmm. we have a problem, because you have Jewish exorcists. Why do you need a Jewish exorcist? Because they're casting out Jewish demons. Mm-hmm. And I'll lay that at your feet, because I know you'll have a lot to say about that.
I see where you're going with it, and it's correct. These things are hugely regional, like geographically regional,
right?
And within Jinn lore, Jinn have been described as being you can have Muslim Jinn, you can have Christian Jinn, you can have
yes, sir,
and so on. And I think you've definitely hit on something which just adds a layer of complexity to it, mm-hmm. which it as you said, it takes away simplistic definitions, because if there is an all-reaching power of God, mm-hmm. then through speaking God's name, it should cast out anything. But that's not the case.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I think there's multiple aspects to it, because I do think the individual's faith, or not even if they have a strong faith in whatever religion they've been brought up in, but if they're in that framework, and yes. you have an awful lot of people that are in that belief system, that in itself can generate a form of power that may be doing the casting out. And I don't know, it's yes. pure conjecture, but I do think there are multiple aspects of things, because I think you're absolutely right. There is this element to feeling residual emotions. They can be down to your family lineage, or indeed you can just pick them up if you're unfortunate enough. And one that is it a carving you mentioned of the Dybbuk with the old man on the skeleton on his back? Mm-hmm. That really resonated with me, because it reminded me of the term hag-ridden, which kind of ties in with the whole idea of the dark shadow man figure. And there's also kind of the idea of the night hag, the nightmares where people wake up,
right,
the feeling of pressure on their chest and they can't move. And sometimes that takes a kind of a more kind of sexual nature, which comes up again.
It does.
But the term for that is being hag ridden, and the term
Hmm.
terminology that's used for people who do have a possession or they do have some sort of parasitical entity attached to them is the idea that they've been ridden. That the disincarnate is using the individual to re-experience the material world through them again. Um,
Hmm.
but the one of the things I do find quite interesting about this, and I've been reading a lot lately about by a fantastic magician called Josephine McCarthy, who is an
Hmm.
extraordinary exorcist. Been reading her book, and she's got a great view of the kind of categorizations of these beings that she outlays in her
Hmm.
the Exorcist Handbook. But she talks in depth about parasites and how they can be very similar to demons, and really get into somebody and kind of be wrapped into them, where they will need extraction, and that influences behavior and the obsessive behavior
Hmm.
of addiction, of destructive behaviors, because those addictions, they are feeding off that behavior. They're feeding off the emotions generated from that behavior.
Yes.
And it's another
Yes.
aspect, and again, when we talked about initially, when we started chatting about this being kind of the rabbit hole, it's like it's just another layer to it, and it seems to me there's a huge spectrum of things going on. um,
Hmm.
and when you talk about kind of these beings having their own belief system, when you kind of well, when I looked into the world of jinn, there's a great book um, by an author called Robert Liebling called Legends of the Fire Spirits, and it's a
Hmm.
superb anthology of jinn and genies from well, all across the Arabian Peninsula and into North Africa and so on. And
Hmm.
it talks about like clan structures and family structures and even cities of the jinn, which
Hmm.
are believed to be around a mythic mountain in the North Pole called Mount Quef. The levels of lore to this are just huge. Um,
Oh yeah.
but certainly kind of going back to your original topic of why are these things regionally specific? You know,
Right.
why does Islamic exorcism work for Islamic possession and not for Christian possession, not for Jewish possession, and vice versa? Um,
Right.
and I do think part of that is the religious framework the individuals have grown up in, and are just part of that. It's almost epigenetic. Um, but that's just a theory. There's huge scope to it. Like it's baffling.
It's massive, and it's a beautiful mystery. It really is. I mean, I'll tell you what, this literature saved my life. Researching this stuff, I mean, as dark as it can be, it's fascinating because it's a glimpse into a reality that we have been robbed of for
Yeah.
thousands of years, if not all of history. Now, getting into Marzinski's work,
Mm.
did you notice how much of consent these entities looked for?
Yes. Yeah. Really interesting, and how some people actually missed the entities when they left.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's in dealing with that and taking that, let's move on to, well, actually, let's move back to the Dybbuk phenomenon. Like I said, it wasn't a box of bones. I mean, that's where it originated. That's where everybody said it was. No, what happened was these rabbis and these exorcists, and I'm not going to pig trail off the consent thing. I'm going to stay on that same thematic element. But the Dybbuk, what would happen was you would have a handmaiden or a newly married woman
Mhm.
who had recently consummated her marriage, and she would, wake up in the middle of the night thinking her husband is, trying to be friendly or whatever, and
Yeah.
thinking, he's touching the legs, and she's like, okay, and something is becoming very physical with her. Well, she turns around and nothing's there. And
Yeah.
then for 5 minutes, she's assaulted in ways that are unimaginable.
Sure.
So what these exorcists began to realize, this is where the Dybbuk came from. This gets into Father Sinastri's work as well.
Right.
But what they began to realize was that these quote-unquote demons They have sensual desire. And what they would do, and they will groom these victims. They will groom these victims by wooing them romantically. And so they will produce emotions and physical touch in order to manipulate them into giving them consent to, at the end of result, to possess them. It was never possession and then, I don't know if I can say this, but you know what I'm saying? It's not possession and then sex, okay? If I could say that, because some radio shows don't let me do that. But it was always sexual molestation or rape and then possession. It was never. And so when they were dealing with these people, they would have these demoniacs, or, you know, quote unquote demoniacs, would show up and they would be like, okay, like, what's wrong with you? What happened? Well, you know, it all started a year ago, and it would come into my room in the middle of the night and touch me and all this stuff. It would whisper in my ear and rub my back and all this stuff, and now I'm possessed by it. So then they said, okay, they started asking questions like Father Sinastri did. If these incubus and succubus spirits are wanting intimacy with physical, mortal humans, they must have a sensual desire and or the hardware, quote unquote, hardware to fulfill such an act. And that's what led these exorcists to think, okay, you know, maybe this isn't Beelzebub. Maybe this is Bob. Right? Maybe this is, because it's far too human. So then that's when they started asking questions, and then come to find out it was not a demon at all. It was simply a person who was a rapist in his past life. Like, okay, yeah, they had a case in 1999 in Baghdad where the lady was raped and was possessed. She said, I am possessed by the spirit that raped me. So they began to talk to it. What's your name? Here's what blows my mind. Does anybody ask themselves? I know I do, but sometimes I could be nutty and crazy, but why would demons have names? Like, what? We have names. Like, you don't go up to an animal and say, hey, what's your name? It's an animal. It's a dog. Well, that's how it started. And the Catholicism has continued that tradition. But it started out, what's your name? And then it was like, you know, hey, my name is so-and-so. Okay, where are you from? Blah, blah, blah. You know, that's where I'm from. How did you die? And why are you here? And then when are you leaving? It was a dialogue. It was a dialogue. Because what happens is you begin to understand what it believes in and what it values. And I think going back to Catholicism, and I honor all, I mean, I'm a big fan of Adam Bly, just, you know, especially Malachi Martin. I love me some Malachi. Oh my God, I love that man. He's awesome. But the problem is, see, they changed their rite of exorcism. I think it was in 1999. The Vatican issued a kind of a, I don't know, more or less a rebuttal against the old ways of exorcism. But they said something in the in the 1600s, they created their creed of exorcism. Then they rectified it, and I think it was, like I said, 1999. Anyways, the 16th century version of it, this is fascinating, because they trip over themselves all the time when trying to deal with these demons. They simply stated that the reason we throw holy water on the demoniac is to remind the demon of baptism. Now, right? Did your ears perk up there? Because mine did. Why? Because, you know, it's an old belief. Comes back to the first century. That the dead things are underneath the water. So the afterlife, Sheol, was underneath water. So, you know, so the whole concept is this: when you're baptized, it was a form of exorcism. So in Christianity, we call it a watery grave, right? You're buried with Christ. You are now a new creature. So when you come out of the water, the old man is dead, right? All things are passed away. So they said the reason that they're afraid of the holy water is because it reminds them of the exorcism of baptism, right? That's what they said.
Okay.
Now, I want to ask you a question because I know I've been rambling. I want to ask you a question. When has a demon ever been baptized enough? One time. To remember it, number one, and to be afraid of it, number two.
Sure. Huh. Yeah, I mean, it raises questions about the origin, doesn't it?
Yeah. It's so when you start to see, I mean, it's right in front of us. It's always been right in front of us. The rite of exorcism, like you said, you touched on it. I would love to hear your thoughts on more on this particular area. But yeah, what if it's not you're delivering the person by sending the spirit off? It's very possible that you're traumatizing that entity because you're relying, number one, when you throw holy water on a demoniac, you're relying upon the memory of the demon to have authority over it. What if it never got baptized, right?
Yeah.
And that's Father Sinastri, and we can get into that if you want. It's crazy. The stuff is fascinating.
It really is. I'm gonna have to wrap up soon.
Okay.
But
that's fine.
But I think we should do this again. I think there's definitely more for us to unpack here.
Oh man, I thoroughly enjoyed myself. I knew I would. I was like, I got to talk to this guy. You're a legend, brother. I was looking at your work today.
Thank you so much.
And especially, I think it was facial equality, man. That really.
Oh, cheers! Thank you.
I mean, for people to even think about that, that is so beautiful. Okay. I'm telling everybody about you. Yeah, maybe next time we'll get into the incubus, succubus, and then Father Sinastri's work.
Yeah.
And I want to hear more about your gin, because you're like the gin expert, man.
Cheers. Well, I mean, likewise, I'd love to I kind of pick your brains about the Christian view of this. It'd be super interesting and really educational.
Awesome. I enjoyed myself, sir. Thank you.
Well, let's do it again. It's been an absolute pleasure.
All right, brother. You have a good one and have a good weekend, sir.
Take care. You too.
All right.
So there you have it, folks. I hope you enjoyed that. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much, Nathaniel, for coming on. There was a huge amount that we got through. I had to edit some stuff out because the audio wasn't great, kept breaking up. But we'll do it again real soon. There was a lot there. We went through the Dybbuk phenomena, jinn, obviously, demons. What are they? Unclean spirits. The hag phenomena, being hag-ridden. And all the kind of different kind of unpleasant intricacies and overlapping motifs within this area. So it was really interesting. I look forward to do it again. You can find Nathaniel across the web. Plenty more audio recordings of him and his work out there. So be sure to seek him out and follow him. So I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, give us a like and subscribe. And take care.